for Bioethics in the College of Medicine. Welcome to this super interesting discussion about the ethics of risky research. This has been something that has really been bugging me throughout the pandemic, and just thinking there's all this news articles about the ethics of challenge trials and just let people do this risky research. And I would just love to pick our two distinguished guests' brains about the way in which they sort of think about risk when it comes to research, how to sort of negotiate high-risk research, and what should we think about in terms of the IRB approval when it comes to research that has real risks to it, but also sometimes has people that really want to participate in that kind of research. So we are welcoming you all. This is the Center for Ethics and Human Values monthly panels on conversations around research ethics. It's supported by the College of Medicine, the OSU College of Medicine Center for Bioethics, and the OSU College of Public Health. And today we have Dr. Robert Steele, who is a philosopher trained at the University of Pittsburgh, and was a postdoctoral associate at the Center for Population Level Bioethics at Rutgers, and then was at University of Nebraska, Omaha, and is recently minted, within the past week, a new, I think, research bioethicist. Is that how you call it? At the Center for Bioethics at the National Institutes of Health. And we also have Dr. Singer. Dr. Singer is also recently minted at Ohio State. We're so excited to have you. Before just arriving to the OSU Department of Urology as the inaugural division chief of urological oncology, Dr. Singer was faculty at the Rutgers Center Institute in New Jersey. And he received his medical degree with honors at Georgetown. And Dr. Singer, besides doing general surgery and urological surgery, is a clinical ethicist and has really thought deeply about these issues and has published them and has trained others on these issues. And so I'm super excited to have this conversation between the two of you. So basically the structure of the panel is going to be, Dr. Steele is going to start with sort of an overarching sort of framing of some of the issues that you've been thinking about and how you understand risk. And then I have some preset questions that I'm going to throw to, and after that, Dr. Singer is going to sort of respond from your own experiences, both as a surgeon and a clinician, but also as a bioethicist, how you've been thinking about these issues. Then I'm going to start with some questions, some preset questions that we've already sort of come together to talk about. And then audience, we also would love to hear your questions. So if you have any questions throughout the presentation, at the bottom of your screen, there's a little Q&A box. Please write those questions there. We're going to try and save the last 15 minutes or so for questions and answers from the audience. So to no further ado, why don't we let Dr. Steele start the show.
Thank you so much. Very excited to be here. So, hi everyone. I am Robert Steele, and I'm in the Clinical Center Department of Bioethics at the National Institutes of Health. Despite that affiliation, though, everything I say here is just my own opinions. I'm not speaking for or representing the US federal government in any way. My training and PhD, as mentioned, in philosophy, and I work on research ethics, and I'm very excited for this conversation. Thank you to Dr. Howard for inviting me, Dr. Singer for coming as well, and also, of course, to the funders and support staff that make events like this possible. Okay, so I'm going to open by saying a bit about how I think about risky research and what studies have moved me to think this way, and how my thinking differs from others in the field. And this is just a master slide. This is going to be the one slide you get for the next 10 minutes, but hopefully it can help you follow along. Pretty much says what I'm going to say. So in my case, it's easiest to approach the topic through the middle question to say a bit about the studies that led me to think the way I do about the topic. That's because I started working on this topic through a project I did on a particular kind of trial, that is risky HIV cure studies. So that's really framed my thinking. So let's talk about those studies for a bit. As background, current treatments for HIV are highly effective and people living with HIV can live largely normal lives. Importantly, we now know that while virally suppressed, people living with HIV cannot transmit infection with HIV through sex, which has eliminated a major source of stigma and anxiety that was associated with living with HIV. At the same time, though, not everyone tolerates the medications equally well. They can be burdensome to take, burdensome and expensive for health systems to administer, particularly in low-income contexts. And even when patients are compliant, they still suffer from reduced life expectancies and earlier onset of late life morbidities. For instance, people living with HIV have higher rates of heart attack and dementia. So despite the existence of these highly effective treatments, there are still good reasons to be looking for a cure. In fact, 5 people to date appear to have been successfully cured of HIV. The first person to be cured was initially known as the Berlin patient, later identified themselves as Timothy Ray Brown. Mr. Brown received a bone marrow transplant from a person with a rare genetic variant that confers resistance to HIV. And the thought was, okay, maybe that will afford him the same resistance and will actually cure him of his infection. That would be a crazy thing to do just in order to attempt to treat someone's well-managed HIV infection. Like, that was the point. The risks of well-managed HIV infection are just not that high in comparison to the risks of transplant, which are quite high. But this experiment was possible because Mr. Brown already needed a transplant for unrelated medical reasons. So the experiment was just, oh, what if we give him this kind? What effect will that have? Not all potential cures involve transplants. Many other strategies are also being tried, but many of them are also just risky in independent ways. Like, checkpoint inhibitors have been explored as part of an HIV cure. It's also known that they can cause heart failure, and so on and so forth. Beyond the interventions themselves, there are also risks associated with the research procedures. So measuring the effect of HIV cures requires taking people off their regular medication in what's known as an analytic treatment interruption. These interruptions are necessary because although current medications do stop HIV from actively replicating in the bloodstream, the virus still persists in reservoirs throughout the body, and those reservoirs can't be directly measured at present. So the only way to tell if they've been cleared, or at least brought under immune control, is by stopping a person's medications and waiting to see if the virus comes back. Although opinions now coalescing around the idea that short interruptions are generally safe, they're certainly not optimal as a form of clinical management, and some newer designs for studies even tolerate patients undergoing significant periods of viral rebound before they get restarted on their medication, in order to allow for the possibility that an initial rebound could lead to the reestablishment of immune control later, which is a pattern that has been observed in studies in primates. So if the same thing could maybe work in humans, that's a reason to let people actually have high viremia for a while before restarting the medications. So the top line here is that curing HIV is a worthy project, but because existing treatments are very effective and potential cures are unlikely to work, this is all phase 1 stuff we're talking about, they're risky in administration, and they require stopping people's medication to measure their effects, the trials look like they're medically quite a bad deal for participants. On the traditional view, where trials have to have a decent medical prospect, that would make it questionable whether they can be ethically conducted. And although, as you'll see, I do ultimately support the conduct of these trials, I'll be the first to agree that if you're a person living with HIV who is primarily interested in protecting and promoting your own health, then you absolutely should not be in an HIV cure trial. That is not the right place for you. The thing is, not everyone living with HIV is actually a person who is overall, above all else, interested in protecting and promoting their own health. Like, yes, everyone cares about that to some degree, but people's lives contain a range of different values, interests, and they exist in a range of situations. In the case of HIV, the history of the disease and its prevalence in certain subcultures, particularly gay subculture, has led to the existence of a strong disease community, including many patient activists who personally identify with the cause of advancing treatments for HIV. So that's a value some people have, and it's a value that can lead someone to rationally and reasonably be willing to participate in trials, even including ones that are not good for their health. In addition to different people having different values, there are also people living in importantly materially different life situations. For instance, patients living with HIV who are in hospice in the process of dying have been interviewed in qualitative studies expressing a desire to use the end of their lives to contribute to medical science and expressing dismay at having been excluded, ostensibly for their own benefit, on the basis of their fragile health. Thing is, they don't see that as their benefit. They see their benefit as finding meaning in the end of their lives and making a valuable contribution. And arguably, they're right to see it that way. So there's a situation, the situation of being in hospice, which can also change what is rational and reasonable for people to seek out. So participation in cure research is a bad deal, medically speaking, but I still think there are people for whom it makes sense as a choice given their interests, values, and life situations. And so that's what I think we should care about when we think about risks in research. And that distinguishes my view from traditional views in the field, according to which regulators really should be assessing trials just in terms of their narrow health effects. They should forbid them from going forward when they look like they're too much of a bad deal. I think that's the wrong question. The question we should be focused on is whether a trial can succeed in enrolling people for whom it makes sense to be there, and whether it can avoid enrolling people for whom it doesn't make sense to be there. Now, it's important to note that there is a lot of overlap between the question I like and the more traditional question about the balance of purely medical benefits and harms. This is because most people participating in biomedical research are not passionate HIV activists. Most people participating are there primarily because they want to access what they see as the best possible treatment for their condition, or because they can access a treatment for free through being in medical research, or because they're being paid to be in medical research. If what participants value is their health, then the participants for whom it makes sense to enroll will be the ones for whom the trial promotes their health. And in that case, asking whether a trial will be able to enroll people for whom it makes sense to be there will be very similar to asking whether it has an acceptably good medical prospect associated with it overall. So I think overfocus on the sort of statistically normal case where people really do just mostly care about their health has led the field to adopt what I take to be a limited and unpersuasive view that health is really all that matters in these situations. Henry Beecher said something like this in the Beecher Report, that nobody's trying to sacrifice themselves for social progress. So if you see a study protocol that appears to be sacrificing people for social progress, you can bet your butt that those participants did not give their genuine informed consent to be there. They were manipulated, lied to, or they just didn't get it. But whatever, they weren't trying to actually be injected with cancer cells or anything like that. No one wanted that to happen to them. I, as much as the next person, think that that's right in many cases. If I see a study that requires its subjects to make heinous health sacrifices, the first question I'm going to be wondering about is whether they really understood. But where I differ from Beecher is I'm willing to allow the answer might be yes. Give me enough semi-structured interviews with participants where the predominant theme extracted was altruism, and eventually I'll accept, yeah, like they get it. I myself signed up, speaking of coronavirus challenge trials, I signed up on one day sooner to be in a coronavirus challenge trial. I wanted to do that. I knew full well it was a bad deal medically speaking. I knew that there was a low but non-zero chance of death. I knew that there was a low but higher and non-zero chance of serious long-term morbidities. I think at the time I signed up, I was looking at data out of France that was like 0.007% mortality in men in my age range. So it's like, okay, well, maybe that's what I'm looking at. Yeah, I knew it was a bad deal medically speaking, but it was still an authentic choice that I was making that made sense in light of my values. And I think if I'm capable of accepting some bad deals, I don't know why I would think nobody else could be either. Anyway, that's a sketch of my view. I think I've run slightly over the amount of time I was supposed to take, so I'm going to move on. I'm not going to give any more elaboration. I think the structured questions will give us a chance to get into more detail, but that's the top line. And thank you again, everyone, for showing up and listening.
Thank you so much. And Dr. Singer, do you want to just sort of present from your own perspective as a clinician and bioethicist, like how have you been thinking about risk and your relationship with your patients and potential research participants in terms of the ethics of risky research?
Sure. Thanks so much for the invitation to be here. And Dr. Steele, thanks so much for your insightful comments and your fantastic papers that I had the opportunity to read. Just by a little bit more background, I've been involved with ethics consultation for a little bit more than 20 years and been a PI on clinical investigation, clinical trials for a little bit more than 10 years, but I come from a cancer worldview. So I apologize, that's sort of my space. So that's where all my analogies and reference points sort of go back to. I would say that I agree much more with Dr. Steele's spoken comments than perhaps some of the details in some of the papers. But I think we're largely coming from a same place. I mean, having been at the NIH as well, Zeke, Christine, and David's paper, What Makes Clinical Research Ethical, 2020 JAMA, is still, I think, one of my most cited and referred to papers. And I think you're encapsulating a lot of that in terms of your respect for informed consent, wanting to balance risks, make sure that we have a just system of who's being enrolled and who may benefit from the results of the research. I also heard echoes of Pellegrino and Temasma in your comments when they recognize a hierarchy of good. So biomedical good not being the end all, but really the base of that hierarchy of good, with altruism and community engagement and community connections being important facets of that too. And I guess, like all real good ethics conversations start off with, I would say, in terms of your comments about risky research, it depends, right? I mean, you're sort of really describing different scenarios in terms of what you're describing for potentially HIV cure studies versus some of the other examples you've used in some of your recent papers, where you're talking about required research or making people participate in research as part of an agreement of getting care. So I think that's fascinating. And again, I think good research and good research ethics comes from good facts and understanding the situation. And having been an IRB member for many years, an SRB member, I would say that if our IRB or SRB or Data Safety Monitoring Board lacks the expertise, the content experience needed, that's when we really need to bring in outside advisors instead of just saying, no, this is too much risk. Our safest job is to prevent this from happening, but really it's incumbent on us to engage with the folks who can help us and achieve our goals of advancing science while protecting study volunteers. Again, they're not necessarily patients. I think subjects is really falling out of vogue, but these are volunteers, and to keep that in mind. So thank you so much, Robert. Really enjoyed your opening comments and look forward to the questions and discussion.
Thank you so much. So let me start with a very sort of broad question. People talk about risk, they talk about harms, but sometimes I'm like, what are we talking about? So this is like my philosopher hand. So, I mean, what harms should we be worrying about when it comes to assessing the risks of research? And are we worried about all of the harms that actually are associated with current research practices? Why don't I start with Dr. Singer, and then we could go with Robert or Dr. Steele afterwards.
Sure. I mean, in terms of risk, as a surgeon as well, if we're talking about innovative surgery or surgical research, that's often very hard to conceptualize risk because we're sometimes doing things for the first time or the first time in this patient population or this age group. So it's not only the risks we know, but it's the risks we may not have anticipated yet. Again, when I think about it and I'm writing protocols, I'll sort of go back to Dave Wendler's writings on therapeutic misconception. And really, my goal and my focus is to have the patient understand how participating as a study volunteer is going to be different from what our standard of care is. If they can articulate what some of those key differences are, then I feel that they've done a pretty good job, or at least we've done a pretty good job of trying to explain what this is, why we're doing it, and how it's different. So that's sort of one of the things I look to.
Can I interrupt you, Dr. Singer, because you're in the oncology space? I'm just wondering, like, that seems to be like a really big issue when it comes to oncological research. And I mean, just sort of the worry about prospective benefit and therapeutic misconception. Can you tell us like sort of your experience as both a researcher and a clinician in this space, like how you navigate those kinds of misalignments between the expectations of participants and the sort of prospects of benefit and the risks of research?
Sure. I mean, most of the trials that I'm involved with are stage 2 and 3. So further on, the phase 1, first in human is something that my colleagues do, but I haven't really been involved with that. So that's a little bit different. Where with phase 2 and phase 3, at least with the endpoints that we've chosen, the things we're looking at to say, is this a successful outcome or not, are things that would often be important to patients with cancer. So phase 3, we're often looking at survival. That's a great endpoint and is of great importance to patients with cancer. Phase 2, we may be looking at seeing if tumors are getting smaller. That also is a surrogate, but often an important endpoint for patients with cancer. One of the confounding factors is that I do both, right? So I'm both a standard of care providing surgeon and systemic therapies, and also put on my investigator hat. So one of the things that I have to do is make it clear that I have equipoise in terms of, and doesn't necessarily have to be me, I sort of believe in more of a community equipoise. So we don't know which of these two things is better. This is the problem. You have that problem. This is why we think these two things are reasonable choices. And for most of what we're doing in phase 2 and phase 3, it's standard plus something else. So very rarely would there be some sort of placebo or things like that. So it's often standard treatment plus some other thing for you to go on. And again, is that going to be congruent with your wishes, goals, expectations, things like that? So I think a lot of the risk of therapeutic misconception is usually pretty low, because the way things are built. I mean, rarely are we doing a purely placebo controlled, but there's certainly people who don't understand the randomization process, and that's something that will often take a lot of work, where they're like, okay, I want this one, or Singer's going to choose the one that really he deep down thinks is the best thing. And I'm like, that's not how this goes. Flip of the coin, random computer generated number. But again, if we can say, this is what you would get if you did it anywhere, this is what you would get if you enroll in the study, and focus on those, I find that often the clearest way to try to achieve that goal.
Thank you. That's super clarifying. Thank you. And so, so Dr. Steele, do you have like, going back to the original question about harms, like what sort of harms should we be focusing on when it comes to assessing risk in research?
So I think it varies depending on like which actor you want to talk about. So like the government funds a lot of research, and there are certain harms that the government maybe should distinctively care about. And so when it's thinking about making funding decisions, it should allocate accordingly and try and manage the things that are its legitimate interests. Those might differ to some degree from private funders. So like private funders may have certain missions that say that you should really care about this kind of harm and not so much about that other kind of harm. A charity that is dedicated to curing blindness is going to have a special focus on blindness, and that's going to be one of the harms most relevant to it, and so on. But then also practitioners will have their own values and interests, and they will be individual subjects bound by individual ethics. So different perspectives depending on who you're talking about. I do think that there has been a focus, again, the more traditional view of the role of the IRB, if you take their perspective, is that they're really focused on preventing harms to patients and patient participants, subjects. I'm using language that encourages the therapeutic misconception here. So they're really focused on preventing harms to participants, but they take the view of harms to participants as what we need to prevent is something that I think is bad happening to you. Sort of like regardless of whether you think it's bad, and sort of regardless of how it fits into your values or what you're trying to do. Like what you're trying to do here is not really on the page in the traditional assessment of the harms that need to be mitigated in research. And that's the shift that I'm arguing for them to take, is that instead of thinking about whether something I think is bad is going to happen to you, think about whether you understand what's going on, you accept the risks that there are in your own value scheme. This is a choice that makes sense. Like, those are the questions they should be looking for. And then what they're trying to prevent, the harm that they're trying to prevent, is people getting into research where they don't belong, or also another harm that is relevant, people having research where they really do belong, but then not being able to access it because they've been excluded.
Right. So now I'm going to jump into a question that I think there might be some disagreement between the two of you. So I'm like really excited to hear your thoughts. So do you think that there is, I mean, one thing that we've been talking about a lot so far is everyone's like, it depends, right? It depends what the harm, it depends on the person, it depends on the context. But in general, do you think that there is an upper limit to acceptable risk when it comes to IRB approval? Or another way to ask this is it the role of the IRB to stop some, not all, but some risky research from taking place, even if certain people want to participate, even if you can sort of know, like you can test it and see that they know full well what the risks are? Why don't I start with Dr. Steele this time, and then we could go to Dr. Singer.
Yeah, because I do have a take. Basically, I think in principle, no. In practice, there are many barriers. Like, look, there's this epistemic barrier. There's this barrier just in terms of how easy is it to know that someone really understands what they're getting into. And if you make what they're getting into sufficiently out of this world and horrible, then it would take me a lot to convince me that anyone who said they were signing up for it actually knew what they were doing. Like, this research study, we're gonna, vivisect you over the course of a month. You'll never get any anesthetic. If someone came up to me and said, like, yeah, I really value being in that study, the amount that they'd have to go through to convince me that they really knew and they weren't being secretly held hostage, or they didn't have some conspiracy theory beliefs about what was going on or whatever, it would be an enormous amount. And also, again, because these are overseen by the state's not obligated to put the amount of resources that would be required to verify that about a person into actually verifying it about them so the research can go forward. It's entirely legitimate for both governmental and non-governmental funders to just say, we're not interested in doing that. We're not going to support that process, even if it would be okay if it were to happen successfully. That's not our business, particularly when the research is not very high value. Because, like, who's going to spend all those resources to verify that someone really wants to be vivisected in order to help develop a treatment for male pattern baldness or whatever? It's like, no, it just doesn't matter. Who cares? People vary in what they care about. Replace with your own example as needed. But in principle, no, especially for really highly valuable research, I think what mattered, it's a free country. People get to choose their lives and their values. Have you seen some of the risky stuff that we let people do in other contexts? I would recommend watching the documentary Free Solo about this guy, Alex Honnold, who wants to climb, I think, El Capitan with no ropes or harnesses or anything. That's his big project. And it's just like, it's so risky. And it has, if anything, really negative externalities for everyone else. Like, he might traumatize his friends and family when he gets smushed, or he's gonna like be in an ICU after falling for like 3 weeks and they're gonna have to medevac him out or whatever. Yet we let him do it anyway, because we're like, it's his life and he can choose for himself. But why we would let him do that, which is like so valueless and pointless, like, oh my God, who cares about climbing a mountain? But then, like, we wouldn't let the Alex Honnold of being in HIV cure research or coronavirus challenge trials or whatever do that. That just seems weird to me. Like, I don't know what social values or normative theory is going to give you that disconnect. So in the extreme case, I'm kind of willing to bite the bullet. Just.
So maybe Dr. Singer, maybe there is, you can if there is like a disconnect that you can find between those two cases, or in your own view, do you think that there should be an upward limit of acceptable risk when it comes to IRB approval?
Yes, and I would know it when I see it, of course. Like you know, it's hard to really tell. It's funny, the mountain climbing example. One of my mentors in urologic oncology surgery, he would tell, when we would be having conference talking about complicated cases we were planning to do, he'd remind us that we're like mountain climbers. We don't expect to get into trouble, but we've prepared for it. So, you know, even your example, I mean, the number of people who have died climbing Mount Everest is much higher than this guy who's an elite world-class climber, who meticulously prepared, and spoiler alert, got up and came back down. You know, that's the key. The return trip is really key. In thinking about some of these things, again, put sort of my surgical hat on, I mean, when we were first talking about doing ECMO, extracorporeal membrane oxygenation, LVADs, ventricular assist devices, surgery for blue babies, tetralogy of Fallot, I mean, things where the alternative to an innovative or experimental approach was death, I think we had some compelling reasons based on animal research and other things to say we can try this. But I think the things that are important in that is that they were scientifically valid studies. They were rigorously designed. They were going to be able to give us an answer, whether it was positive or negative, that would have external validity that we'd be able to apply to other patients. And they were not otherwise feasible. So again, echoing Zeke et al., you know, JAMA 2000, sort of the 7 requirements for ethical research. Is this something that will actually can be done some other way, or is this the only way to do it? And another example that sort of comes to mind is many years ago when we were thinking about doing bone marrow transplant for women with metastatic breast cancer. And there was a study that was ongoing, and it seemed like they were having success. So people started doing it off study. So that delayed the accrual to the study. And it turns out that it was wrong. It was a negative study. And you know, as a result, we not only potentially harmed participants, but we didn't know the answer to guide future practice until much later. So in terms of the risk, again, I'm going to cop out a little bit and say, yes, it depends. But I do think we can do things that many people would say, wow, that sounds like a really challenging thing to propose. But again, if it's a well-designed study, is going to give us genuine answers that are medically, statistically sound, scientifically valid, and that there's not another way to achieve the endpoint.
That's really helpful. I mean, so 2 things coming up in the Q&A. So there's already questions coming. This is recorded, and if you go to the Center for Ethics and Human Values website, under care panels, all of the recordings are posted there afterwards. Please share the recordings with colleagues and friends. But I mean, the thing that Dr. Singer, you just said, and it seems like both of you are sort of, one of the things that you focused on is the sort of like social value of the research. So it's like actually what matters is the, you know, we talk about risk, we're talking about risk a lot, but we haven't been focusing so much on how we should think about benefit and what the relationship is between the upward limit of risk and what the potential benefit is. So what do you take to be the relationship between the level of risks that participants may incur in the process of research? And one of the things that I'm interested in to hear from you is the prospect of personal benefit for the participant, but then also maybe not necessarily moving beyond personal benefit, the actual social benefit, the importance of the research in a way that goes beyond the participant. How should we be thinking about these trade-offs, and do they have any sort of relationship with each other? Maybe we'll start with Dr. Singer, and then we could go to Dr. Steele.
Yeah, I mean, some of this sounds dangerously close to a trolley problem, where we're, you know, literally counting how many people may be saved or lost depending on a specific action. And of course, it's much more challenging than that. And so I think it's also interesting to explore how we think of ourselves in groups. So the groups that other people may feel I belong to may not be the groups that I most closely resonate with. And that would inform my choices about what research I would want to participate in and what degree of risk I might be willing to accept. So I would say that, you know, I don't have a real calculus to say this kind of research is worth this much human capital or this much social good. I would say it's more sort of a converse to say we're not pursuing things that really seem frivolous or reckless or really disproportionate to what we're trying to do. Again, I spend my time in the cancer space, so that's much less of a problem that I would say we contend with. But certainly I would say there could be a lot of other spaces that would, and not to, you know, pick on any other specialty, but, you know, how much risk are you willing to expose a teenager to for an acne therapy? Or what are we willing to do in terms of bariatric surgery on adolescents? So I think that there are really important questions to ask. But I think, again, in my thinking, I probably come more around to the biopsychosocial good than really trying to get it into a sociological definition of which of these is more valuable to the country or to the citizenry. But as Dr. Steele pointed out, there are certainly discussions about this because it decides who gets funded, right? I mean, the NIH budget is a moral document. It's saying what we value and what we're willing to fund in terms of investigation.
And Dr. Steele, do you have a view of how to sort of figure out the relationship between benefit and risk?
Well, that feels ambitious, but I do have several things I can say, so I'll say some of those things. One is that, so again, I think there's what perspective you're taking up is relevant. So like governments and other funders will have their own perspective of what social value means to them, and they'll be trying to promote it. There's lots of stuff you can do in your life that's risky and has no social value, but no one's involved. So it's just between you and your bad ideas. Like if I want to jump off a roof into a pool, like the police don't show up and stop me. That's just a stupid thing I can do. But then the government isn't like hiring PIs to throw me off the roof into the pool. And once they take that step, then suddenly it starts mattering, well, what value do they see in this activity? Why are they facilitating it? What's the point? So once they're involved and they're facilitating, then, you know, the government has to have some view of what's valuable and what it's trying to do in that activity and so on and so forth. But I think this actually does also arise not just at the government funder level, but also at the participant subject level. And if that, I've emphasized that people have different values and they can value things like making a contribution through medical science. But then if you think that that's what like makes it okay for them to participate, makes it okay for them to be subject to serious risks, it's important that whatever ideas they have about the social value of the research they're in are actually right. And there's a lot of reason to think that they often aren't. People just think that research is way more likely to succeed and make a way bigger impact than it actually is or does. And so like, maybe I'm willing to be in some really experimental, super toxic phase 1 thing because I think, yeah, this is it. We're going to cure my super rare cancer and it's going to be over. And it's like, dude, it's not going to work. Like I've talked, you know, done capacity assessments with some of those patients where like, they think the odds of success in successful translation are like 100. And it's like, they're much closer to 0. And I think that's been recognized for the question of, you know, people's inaccurate beliefs about the medical benefits they're going to get. But it's also important their inaccurate beliefs about the social benefits and whether what they're doing is really helping anyone else. And so that can vary depending on whether the research is going to succeed and how. But also, I think, Dr. Singer, you were extremely correct about the groups that people see themselves as part of and that they care about aren't necessarily the same as what other ones see. in a pluralistic democracy, people are going to care about different things. And I'm not worried about people being in HIV cure research just because it's medically bad for them. I think people can make that choice and it can be a rational and reasonable choice to make. I'm worried about people where it's like they recruited, 20 women from Botswana to be in a phase 1 HIV cure study. And maybe those women volunteered because they want to make a contribution and make a difference. But actually, the thing that's being investigated will never translate to Botswana. It's like we're talking about some really intense infusions, transplants, whatever, that are going to be maybe barely cost effective in a rich country context. And I think it would be like you would be wrongfully taking advantage of them if they had one vision of, oh, here's the good that we're doing through being in this, and it just had nothing to do with the actual good, and you knew that. So I think those sorts of mismatches are things that are important and you need to be aware of when you're thinking about how the social benefits and the personal risks are, balancing each other for participants.
So this is actually like a really good segue into some of the questions from the audience. And thank you for those who have asked questions. Keep them coming. So Jake Earl asks, how confident are we that participants in risky studies are making rational, informed decisions about whether they're taking on the risks for a worthwhile cause? So far, HIV cure research hasn't led to a functional cure. Might folks who enrolled in those studies be disappointed or angry that they took on risks when that didn't lead to any social benefit? So maybe we'll start with Dr. Steele, and if Dr. Singer, you have something to add, feel free to chime in afterwards.
Yeah, I think, so thank you, Dr. Earl. I think potentially, absolutely. If I felt like at the end of a trial, I had been fed a bill of goods about what this research was actually doing, how likely it was to succeed, how likely, even if it succeeded, it was to ever translate to clinical contexts, ever to contexts that I cared about or people like me, then I could be totally pissed. Like, what if I thought this PI was just like chasing publications and advancing their career, and in fact, it had nothing to do with helping the people that I cared about? Then I would be really mad that I had been subjected to this toxic, harmful, medically ill-advised procedure under this false vision of what it was about. Do I think every time that it's not going to translate or that people are mad at the end they're right? No, sometimes people like actually they were informed and it was all transparent and they were on board and it just didn't turn out the way they liked, and then they're mad about it. People get mad. I don't know. People have unpredictable reactions. But in terms of whether a person could reasonably get mad, yeah, I can 100% imagine conditions under which it would be completely reasonable for the participants to be mad afterwards.
Yeah, and as someone who's run trials that are negative, I'm terribly disappointed and mad. I mean, spent years of my life trying to do this. We thought it was a good idea. We had evidence. We thought we had designed it carefully. We spent thousands of hours developing it, and it didn't work. And those are real people behind the scans. Of every one of those scans that showed progression or recurrence, or the lab work that shows the serology, the viral counts. So yeah, the investigators feel that too. I'm not saying that our feelings should be the driving factor in any decisions, but yes, it's clinical investigation is hard. It's fraught with disappointment, but every once in a while, we are able to do something that really changes the practice. And that's why we do it over and over again with our really tremendous study participants and volunteers.
So Tamara Tuttle is asking, I think, a super interesting question about like trying to tease out the sort of differences between the daredevils in other contexts and research daredevils, let's say. So it seems like the riskiest recreational activities are glorified, highlighted, and publicized, while the concept of high-risk research participation is frowned upon and kept rather quiet. When daredevils are seen as heroes, but altruistic potential research participants are met with roadblocks, I wonder what this says about us as a society. I kind of want to push a little bit on this. Like, I mean, what would happen, right, if we did start glorifying or heroifying like research participation, is that something that you think would benefit research, or do you think that that would actually be problematic in terms of really ensuring that we're having the right people participate in research that should be participating, and guarding against people who are participating in research for reasons that are not appropriate? So maybe we'll start with Dr. Singer, and then we'll go to Dr. Steele if you have any views.
Sure. I'm not a huge fan of heroification of most things or people, so that's probably not the word I would go with. I think it's also important to keep in mind, I mean, the number of people who are volunteering for clinical trials is small. I mean, less than 5%, probably 3% of patients would do that. So I would say that, to me, the more interesting project is to figure out why are more people not wanting to do this? Why don't more people say, hey, this is a really good idea? If there's two options and the experts feel like they're both pretty equivalent and this is a thing that I would be eligible for, why don't more people opt for that? I'm also very concerned because study after study, including ones that I've written, have shown that the demographics of people participating in studies skews white, wealthy, and educated. And so I think we're missing out on a lot. And I think the way that we have treated many of our populations in the US and globally, not only historically, but even very, very recently, shows why there's probably considerable distrust and potential aversion to participating in clinical research. So I would say, I would probably want to focus us more on how do we increase the pool of people who want to volunteer, rather than saying we need to, make clinical research into TikTok videos and YouTube things of people doing potentially unwise activities.
Yeah, I would similarly be concerned about certain kinds of glorification, maybe sweeping up the overly impressionable in the net, which then, on my view, would just create more work for the researchers, given that I think they do have some obligation to do their best to screen out the people for whom it doesn't make sense. So if you're encouraging a bunch of people to have the delusional idea that it makes sense for them, even though it doesn't, then that's just like, it's actually more of a problem. I do support cultivating in the public and also ourselves in our hearts the values of the sort that would make it a good idea for us to participate in altruistic activities. I think people should cultivate the value of altruism in themselves and others. And there is this thing where it gets treated, you see a version of this with like altruistic kidney donation. It makes people really uncomfortable. It's like not unequivocally glorified at all. If anyone read the viral sensation Bad Art Friend, that was just like, it was a whole tour through the various kinds of discomfort that people have about altruistic kidney donation. And it seems to me that some of that gets reflected back on research participation as well. People are similarly sort of suspicious of just like, why would you do that? What kind of person would do that? How does that make me feel about myself, given that I'm not doing that? Like, these are questions people have to grapple with, that I would prefer an overall culture which had less hesitant and conflicted attitudes about, look, some people are trying to do good things, and that's great.
Another question from the audience that was trying to tease out the differences between the research ethics context and other daredevil activities is the question of liability. So Maisa Radisi asks, would you say the liability of an institution conducting research adds another layer of risk that should be accounted for, especially in comparison to your example regarding risk and dangerous behavior as a result of personal free decision-making, like climbing a mountain? And this is related to another question that I didn't really get to, but I'm just interested in, so we've been talking about sort of the IRB's role in research participation, and we've sort of implicitly talked about the clinician's role, but how should we think about risk when it comes to the sort of clinician's role or the institutional role of like sponsoring certain research, or the clinician's role of recruiting participants to participate in research? I think, as Dr. Singer really aptly said, it's like the funding, the NIH funding document is like a moral document. It's about priority setting. So how should we think about that rather than on a federal level, more on an institutional or even on a personal level for clinicians? Maybe we'll start with Dr. Steele and then Dr. Singer, if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I think that these are risks that absolutely should be taken into account when thinking about risky research, especially like envelope pushing risky research for which there isn't already established precedents or anything like that. Look, people are working in institutional contexts, the institutions matter. If you think that even though in your heart and in your enlightened moral theory, which you got from me, you think it's totally permissible to let these people take on these risks, if you think, look, if something goes south and someone dies, which maybe because this is like very, very risky research is like an extremely salient possibility, then like it's going to be a PR nightmare. OHRP is going to come down on us like a million bricks. Maybe like all of the funding for my medical institution will get frozen for like 2 years or something. Like those consequences are real and they would affect a lot of people, and you got to think about them. So I think there are all these sort of tactical reasons for trying to manage exposure to risk. Also, one that often gets mentioned in this context is the trust of the public. The public really doesn't like it when people die in research, and there are special concerns about communities of the public that have more adversarial and distrustful relationships towards medical science, and a special idea that we really need to repair and cultivate trust with those populations. So again, I think all of this forms the sort of pragmatic backdrop in which people should be situating themselves and thinking when they think about maybe associating with high-risk research. All of it can give you reasons to not want to associate your personal career, your institution, your political party, or whatever else with certain forms of very high-risk research. I would just distinguish that. I would say, yeah, that's all essentially tactical. The reason isn't because it would be wrong to do it. Not wrong in itself anyway. The reason is because there are all these downstream consequences that we also got to juggle. And so like, let's be smart about that.
If I'm remembering my historical documents, so Nuremberg ensured that research was voluntary. Helsinki reminded us that the investigator's primary responsibility is that of the research participant. So as the PI, as the investigator, it's my responsibility in terms of risk. And so there may sometimes be times where a patient may be technically eligible based on inclusion-exclusion criteria, but there's some other factors that pose them at an increased risk of having some adverse event or severe consequence. And we would talk about it with the patient and with our study team and say, hey, maybe this isn't the patient who we should consider enrolling. But I would say, again, as my role as the investigator or as the PI of the study, it's my responsibility. So, again, it's sometimes uncomfortable and sometimes added challenges, but that is my role to be, carefully running the trial, following our protocol, doing everything we can to minimize risk and maximize potential benefit. But yeah, that is something that will come to me if there are complications or mortalities or other things. That's when I'm going to get audited. So it's very much, again, a personal responsibility of being an investigator to ensure that patient safety is first and foremost, or participant safety is first and foremost in our minds.
So, so this sort of goes to, at some point in 2020, there are all these, I think, hydrochloroquine trials that were still running after the FDA no longer had emergency use authorization allowed for hydrochloroquine for COVID-19. And I think one thing that has come up in the conversation is like the way in which there's actually something really important about participation in research rather than about off-label use or like sort of giving the patients the whatever intervention outside of the trial. And so I'm wondering what you think about this sort of responsibility of clinicians and researchers of steering patients into trials, rather than sort of steering, if they're really interested in like some sort of drug or intervention, rather than sort of prescribing off-label. Maybe I'll start with Dr. Singer and then Dr. Steele.
Yeah, there are some things that we just, as standard of care, is sort of prescribed off-label just because the drug is so old that they never did it in, they never did studies to get it specifically recognized. I think that the hydroxychloroquine piece is really interesting because it goes to Dr. Steele's writings about the importance of learning health systems, where the NHS in England showed that, hey, hydroxychloroquine doesn't work, but surprise, steroids do. And that was a result of their learning health system being able to analyze lots of data anonymously and with broad consent from the people in the health system to rapidly make improvements, both in therapy and also quality improvement in safety. So I think that's an important thing. I don't know if we'll have time to discuss that. But yeah, I think that sort of circles back to the breast cancer example I used, where if we're going to do things, we need to ideally do them in a way that's going to be reproducible, responsible, supported by reasonable evidence, and then give us an answer that's actually usable rather than just exposing a whole lot of patients to something and then not knowing what to do with that information.
Yeah, strong agree. This is when I would definitely want to go to bat for learning healthcare. It's a social disaster when a bunch of different doctors are just doing a bunch of different things in a totally uncoordinated way. Some will give you the hydroxychloroquine off label, some will refuse to prescribe it to you. It's sort of up to them. That's a system in which it's chaotic who gets it and who doesn't, but chaotic in a way that we can't learn anything from very easily, which is like the worst of all worlds. And so we should really be trying to avoid that whenever we can. This is also another case like the breast cancer case where there were negative effects on other stakeholders that were foreseeable and bad. So like my partner's aunt has lupus, and hydroxychloroquine is also a lupus drug that she was taking, but then it became scarce and hard for her to secure it for her own very clearly indicated medical need because it was being diverted into treating people randomly and ineffectively for COVID. So that's another sort of harm you have to worry about when you're, pumping a new fad therapy or whatever that's not going through the clinical channels. And so, yes, let's try and learn from our healthcare and try and, insofar as possible, direct people away from chaotic off-label prescribing and towards clinical trials or standard of care.
With that, I think we are going to end our conversation. We could have continued on and talked a lot more about learning health systems and the ethics of that. Maybe that is a future care panel. Thank you so much, Dr. Steele and Dr. Singer, for your really thoughtful contributions today. You're very nice to each other, but there were some spicy takes as well. I really appreciate everyone who joined us virtually. And the panel is going to be recorded and posted at the Center of Ethics and Human Values webpage. So look there for further details. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks again.